So Native Americans in the Great Basin were some of the last to come into contact with Western settlers. The Great Basin Native Americans are made up of 9 tribes over 7 states that are identified based upon their language, dialects, and differences. The major life ways included agriculturists, horticulturists, pastoralists, and hunter-gatherers, which affected the subsistence of the tribes. They primarily used a hunter-gatherer fisher-folk lifeway where they lived off of wild plants, animals, and fish, and based on a small kin-based society. The climate caused adaptations such as the Joshua tree and lizards in the south, and sagebrush and rabbits in the north. The subsistence of the tribes relied heavily upon their kin-based society, which included a division of labor based on gender and age. Age was a major division, which stated that the parents were responsible for subsistence, grandparents for child rearing and socialization, which means that the education of the children was placed on the shoulders of grandparents, which was typically done in order to have children taught by the most experienced and wise within the camp. This is still a concept in modern education that states that experiences are what people learn the most from, thus those with the most experience would make the best teachers. As a result of the westward expansion, Native American lands were infringed upon. So boarding schools were introduced to the Native Americans in the late 19th century. They were under the jurisdiction of the Bureau of Indian Affairs since their creation in 1882. The 1928 Merriam Report was published due to an uprising and reform of education in the boarding schools. This study found that the Indian Bureau of Boarding Schools lacked federal funding and resulted in some of the worst conditions ever reported, such as children not being clothed or fed properly, not appropriate staff hired, and also schools would lie about the amount of children in which they homed. The terrible conditions led to outbreaks of diseases, illnesses, and in some instances, scurvy. Along with these unfit living conditions, the boarding schools also required the students to engage in vocational training, which is not the type of vocational training that is seen in today, but rather mimics the type of work seen in majorly laborious jobs. In other words, students were imprisoned workers residing in less than ideal circumstances. One school that was present in the Great Basin area worked with Western Shoshone kids located in Stewart, Nevada. And in 1925, an outsider actually got to go into the school, and this was the situation in which he experienced. It wasn't uncommon for Western Shoshone people to engage in rabbit hunts. It was a part of their culture in which they used rabbits for nearly all of their necessities. While students in the Carson boarding school began to suffer due to a lack of basic necessities, an elder brought a gun to 2 brothers so that they may not only engage in their culture, but obtain a form of subsistence for their survival. While one day the 2 brothers engaged in what they saw as a normal part of their lifestyle, they fired a gun at close range to the school. Upon this discovery by school officials, the boys were taken to a disciplinarian who confiscated the weapon with no explanation. And within 24 hours of this confiscation, the 2 brothers had disappeared. The boarding school was located more than 100 miles from their home, which made this expulsion synonymous with a death sentence. But the boarding school in Stewart is not the only boarding school that was around in the Great Basin during this time. And it was not uncommon for the other boarding schools in the region to have similar issues or to attend to students in the same manner. The living conditions were not addressed by the federal government until 1930, when the American public began to notice the severity of the circumstances within the schools. Will Carson Ryan was the first educator appointed to the Indian Bureau as its director. In 1933, he appointed John Collier as his commissioner. They were both advocates for the reformation of the boarding schools and pushed the issue until federal action was taken. And with the aid of the New Deal and funding from the federal government, Collier was able to push the first forms of reform in Indian policy, which was then stopped due to the First World War and loss of strength within the New Deal. So during the Great Depression, the Indian families also struggled along with the rest of America, which made the boarding schools that much more attractive. So in 1931, the boarding schools were actually able to serve well-balanced diets to all students and to clothe all students, even though the economy was crashing, which further strengthened the appeal to the schools. One such school, Cheyenne River, experienced a full capacity in the year of 1931, but regardless of these advances, the Indian Bureau still began closing its schools. In 1928, when the Merriam Report came out, there were 77 boarding schools. By 1941, only 49 remained. One factor that caused this decrease was the creation of Indian Bureau day schools and regular public schools. But the problem with the approach within the boarding schools, which was to prepare kids for urban life, is that most children ended up heading back to their reservations, causing gentrification because they had no knowledge of the language or customs such as clothing, shoes, and hairstyle. And the most detrimental factor that went along with these was that the students in the boarding schools lost their traditional values, which was the defining factor of the differences between Native American tribes and new European settlers. This issue is especially prevalent in the Western Shoshones because out of the 10 boys that went to the boarding school, 9 returned to the reservation. One such person that noticed this problem was Alita Bowler, head of the Carson boarding school, who believed that they should be training schools for rural life. She did implement this in the 1930s, where small ranching was implemented, and then due to alienation, they then began introducing art and history as part of the Indian Reorganization Act. World War II also brought change to the dynamic because of the enrollment of Native Americans in the military and an appeal to the urban city life. But cities offered a variety of service and goods that Native Americans had not been introduced to prior to. So such issues such as loneliness, job instability, and access to alcohol were problems.
The Basque Country by Tabitha Arbalaga. The Basque Country is...
So following the changes in education in the 1930s and 40s came the introduction of tribal members running their own Indian boarding schools or day schools. This change was one in which helped Native American students to learn about their culture, as well as Anglo culture in which they would come into contact if they did leave the reservation. They were some of the last groups to come into contact with new settlers. They were victims of genocide and slavery for more than 100 years. And following the stealing of sacred lands, and Native American children were then taken from their family and longtime homes to be put to work in conditions that were even unfit for the worst criminals. The injustices experienced by them were never fixed. And conditions today are better than they had been in the past, but the American government still continues to seize land and livestock, as is the case of the Dan sisters from Duck Valley. In the state of Nevada, national businesses, though, have given more to the education of Native American students than the national government. Statistics show an increase in the higher education success rate for Native Americans. The national accounts and surveys, however, do not explain or show the ways in which the Board of Education or the federal government have aided in the educational increased success rate of Native Americans. One business in the Duck Valley area that works to help these students achieve a degree in higher education is an international mining company called Barrick Goldstrike. This company hired longtime Duck Valley resident Antoinette Kavanaugh, who was also the previous superintendent and principal in the Nevada area, to help Native American students not only apply, but tour and enroll in higher education schools in the surrounding areas and states. Thus, like Barrick, it is important that all residents of this beautiful country work to help the original settlers, taught the new ones how to thrive on an unfamiliar land. We must also cherish the culture, values, and ancient way of life that built the land in which we all survive off of today. This begins with the education of Native American children across the nation. Thank you.